Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name's Kyle. I'm an SRE with GitHub. I am hosting today along with Tom Kowalski.
Hello.
All right. And today we have special guest Jordan DeBeer joining us.
Hey there.
And we also have Joel Coleman, as always. Think you're there?
Hey there, guys. Thank you so much for the intro there, Kyle. Just a reminder, any of our listeners have any questions at all, want me to kind of jump in, interject there, put them in the chat, and I'll make sure that we get to that topic. So thank you so much.
Awesome. So today we are talking about building a strong SRE culture in an organization. And the way we're kind of going to talk about this is sort of in 3 parts. We're going to start just giving a quick refresher on what SRE is. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the cultural aspects of SRE and then how those cultural aspects can be scaled to an organization. So I'm going to start a little bit with just a quick refresher on what SRE is. So SRE, if you're not sure, it means Site Reliability Engineering or Site Reliability Engineer if you're talking about the role. And the general gist of it is it's a software engineering approach to operational problems, such as reliability. And it's not just a role, but also a mindset. It's an opportunity to shift how production systems are owned and operated. I don't know if Tom or Jordan, you have any other thoughts or anything you want to add to that?
Oh, I think that kind of like hits the nail on the head perfectly. This is, if we think of like DevOps as a philosophy, I think SRE is like an implementation of that. That's one of the kind of mental models that I use, and I think it maps pretty well, whereas SRE is specifically focused on the reliability parts of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I agree as well. I'm interested on the definition of culture as we go into that, but yeah, I think it's a good definition of SRE.
That's interesting. And the definition of culture, right? So like if we talk about SRE in culture, like, SRE is focused on reliability. And if you think about like organizational culture, the way I think about it at least is like what an organization naturally like leans towards when making decisions. I don't know what you both think about that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of culture kind of comes down, maybe I'm getting a little too sociological here, but it's kind of like a shared set of values when we're talking about it around SRE. And I think and I'm really happy you started with like the cultural aspect of it and that question, because I don't think you can do SRE if you don't have that shared set of values across the organization as just something that everyone is aware of and focused on and agrees is like important. And it sets a way for everyone to talk about something, right? You're kind of putting a word in a word in like lexicography to an idea, which is super powerful for kind of like talking amongst an organization. So yeah, that's kind of how I would define culture. It's just the shared set of values.
Yeah, and how you kind of talked about the communicating. And for me, the biggest aspect when I'm thinking of organizational culture is how the organization communicates with each other. I feel like that's a big factor, right? And having that standard of how things are communicated, right? That shared lexicon, like you said. Yeah, that's how I view it. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about SRE in that respect.
Yeah, so let's dig into a little bit of the cultural aspects of SRE. And there's a few that I have sort of, that based on my experience, I think are important, but I would love to hear other thoughts as well. So some of the ones that I see as important, based on my experiences every day are, number one, embracing and accepting failure as an opportunity to learn. You can't really be scared to fail, because otherwise you just get into like a paralysis of decision. And it is important to be reliable, and that's the number one job. But also, you don't learn how to make a system reliable if you don't touch it and analyze it and kind of, yeah. And I think that also leads into having a blameless culture. Like, accepting failure is okay, and when failure does happen, it's not a person's fault. There's something wrong with the system or a process that caused that failure to happen.
That's always hard, right? You say it, you read about it, but yeah, it's hard to do, right? Because everybody has their own, where they're coming from, right? Like, one team, it might be easy to implement that way. But yeah, if you have multiple teams coming together and different perspective, it's very hard to get the blameless, right? I don't know if what experiences you've had and what has helped to kind of set that cultural aspect.
I can say, at least from my side, it definitely, like, if especially when there's not a clear line of like who owns what, it can be easy to just toss the issue to the other side. Like, let's say, for example, like, there's a database issue, an application CC is a database issue. Oh, database team, go fix it. When, nah, that's not necessarily always a solution, right?
Yeah, that you just nailed it, right? That the clear responsibilities. I'm a huge proponent of that, and I feel like that's where a lot of things break down, right? When the issues and it's not knowing who's responsible, right? And not having that transparent and understood across everybody is really big.
Yeah, or like a downstream dependency, right? Like if you have like two microservices and you have a downstream dependency and that goes down, is the reliability on, that product team, or is it on another one? I've seen it kind of like go almost like both ways. Sometimes it's like you own your dependencies and you need to be able to fail gracefully from them. And other times it's like, well, we're fully service oriented architecture and that service wasn't available, so it's not our reliability. I don't think there's really like a right or a wrong way. I think both of those have kind of like pros and cons, and allow for different kinds of organizations. I think the most important part though is just being aware that like you do have to draw the line somewhere for ownership, but ownership doesn't necessarily confer blame, right? Like if an application goes down, it's probably not because an individual did something wrong. They were usually acting in like outside of like security things, like they're acting in like their own the best way that they know how most of the time. And if they fail, maybe it's like a training problem, maybe it's they had too much permissions or something like that. So I think you can still have that concept of ownership, and then when something goes wrong, not conferring it to blame on like individuals. More failures of process than individuals that need to be conferred blame.
Yep, agreed. And like, yeah, I think like those failures are back to kind of like failures being an opportunity, right? Like those are great opportunities to be like, well, why did we have to run this script manually in production? Like, that obviously is a big risk. And I think a lot of what we're talking about touches on another sort of cultural point of like shared ownership, like everybody having a bit of a stake in the reliability of a system. Not just the team that develops the system, but like, operators, people that own infrastructure that the application owns on. Everybody shares a bit of responsibility, and kind of breaking down those silos, so there could be cross collaboration rather than just throwing a problem to a different silo.
Yeah, I think just having the transparency helps with that, because yeah, I feel like you do want someone or teams that are directly responsible, and you can see what they're doing, and understanding that. But I feel like the shared responsibility kind of comes from the transparency. This is what we're doing. You can see this, right? And you should be able to understand it when you're communicating with us, and Yeah, and being able to be able to see the issues if you have it or contribute, right? Having that transparency I really feel like helps with the shared responsibility.
Yeah, and I love you said the ability to contribute, right? Because like, first you enable the transparency so other teams can see what you're doing, but then giving them the power to kind of like go in there and help out. I was working with one service team and they had an issue with their upstream going down, and they were kind of siloed off because they were a different company that was part of the acquisition. And over the process of a couple of years, they kind of started integrating more, giving each other more access to like shared dashboards and that sort of thing. And eventually they got like code access to, the upstream, each other's code bases. And they were able to collaborate like way more effectively from a technical perspective in that regard. And obviously there was still like a cultural and organizational aspect to blending those two teams. But yeah, giving them the ability to actually go in there and help out, help both teams. So upstream was able to improve their reliability, and therefore the downstream was as well. So super, super good point there.
We actually had a recent one at GitHub where there was an incident, kind of like one of the outcomes was both one of the application teams whose database was impacted, the database team working together to kind of really dig in and kind of not just solve like the easy win, but kind of dig a little bit deeper and find some like more deep, like rooted issues that resulted in more of a larger win for the organization as a whole. So I think that's another great example of that working well. Now, sort of like one of the last ones, and this is kind of, we talked about this in the beginning, is reliability is number one. It's great if you add a bunch of new features, but like if your system's down all the time and people aren't going to trust it, and even if you add some shiny new features, it's not going to matter if your customers don't trust that your system's going to do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that reliability should be treated just like any features, right? Security, it should be prioritized the same. It's kind of hard to do, right? There's like rice scores and things like that, but I think they should be all stacked up right next to each other, from security to reliability to the value, right? The features that you're delivering, which in turn is all kind of value to them. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's the perfect way to think about it, because if you give me $1 billion, like I can add some nines of reliability to your system. Like you don't even need to tell me anything about it. If you give me $1 billion, I know I can do that. But actually being able to say like, hey, this is a feature, it is a thing that exists that we want to get towards, and you treat it like a feature, the most important feature, it lets you put a price on that reliability. So if you could increase your reliability by like, from 2 to 3 nines by spending $10, would you do that? Well, no, we don't really care. This application's only available from 9 to 5. If it goes down at 7 p.m., nobody actually cares. Or, yeah, we have 1 million users. If I can spend, a little bit of extra money in order to improve that reliability, or spend the effort and the time in order to get there, I want to do it. So yeah, treating it like a feature, the most important feature, really lets you evaluate it against other things, and lets you think about how you want to spend your time. Do you want to add that new feature in order to get some new customers, or do you need to improve the reliability? And SLOs are part of the way you get there, but yeah, treating it as the most important thing, but as a feature in and of itself, is, I think, super important.
I think that leads greatly into like the last point I want to make, is like embracing risk and having the numbers and like the money to tell you like, hey, like, can I do something experimental, or do I need to focus on reliability? And there's a lot of ways to do that, like error budgets. But that gives you like a good indication of like when's the right time to embrace risk, and when is it time to step back and focus on reliability.
I think, yeah, I've never dealt with those, but yeah, Jordan, if you've like the SLOs and like being able to, really give that concrete value, right, assigned to it, at a small scale, but I'm sure it's a lot different, like Google or other places.
It's kind of, I think it started with like security, but I think it the same story with like reliability. Like I'm pretty sure Google could get like much closer to 100% reliability just across the board if we turned off version control. Like just stop like developers from doing anything. And then all of a sudden,
no
like
changes.
no changes. And now
Yeah.
all of a sudden, everything's up all of the time. We're really good at dealing with hardware failures, and most companies, get there. But if you're not actually saying like, hey, we know we're going to have some downtime, you're not actually targeting, 100% availability, then all of a sudden 100% availability isn't your goal anymore. It's, 5 nines or 4 nines or, however you want to measure your reliability there, SLOs and things like that. It really gives you the ability to embrace that risk and say like, yeah, this might go down, this might happen. It's an experiment, but we're going to be better off at the end for it. And we actually have kind of the error budget to do that. I think if you don't have this kind of like cultural foundation, like the part that I think we want to talk about, like scaling the culture, if you don't have this and the other kind of points as well, you'll never be able to scale it because you just don't have the foundation to stand on.
Agreed. Yeah, and having that data as well to kind of like to show to others like, hey, this is what things look like is really important. Yeah. So like taking these and sort of scaling them, I kind of see it as, you can combine sort of like a bottom up approach and like a top down approach to achieve this. I think one of the most important things, at least from like the bottom up, is education and communication. Like having channels to like communicate the sort of principles of SRE, show people in implementation how that works, whether it's like workshops, having like good documentation that is easily referenceable so people can easily know what the right thing to do is. I think it's really important as well.
Yeah, for me, when when you're talking about the top down and bottom up, it's you want the things to come bottom up, right? To have that ownership for the teams and their decisions and what they're doing. But I feel like from the top down, it's the responsibility is to facilitate that, right? Facilitate that communication and transparency and enabling the teams to do that bottom up, kind of setting the guardrails, right? So it's not, all willy-nilly, but this is the set standards, but allowing the bottom up to make those decisions, to feel empowered to do that. It's kind of how I see the play in top and down and bottom up.
Yeah, the top down kind of approach is less about like you're doing SRE with an iron fist and more enabling teams to actually embody those sorts of like values and that culture, and helping set the vision for the company, as well as like take those values of SRE and make sure that they're broadly distributed across the organization. Because I've never seen a new CEO, CTO come in and say like, yeah, we do SRE now, and it actually like just work. It's something that kind of like has to come from software engineers and operations teams and SREs and things like that. So the top-down approach is less iron fist and more enabling that adoption and cementing those values.
I can give an example of like sort of recently at GitHub, what we've been doing is like these weekly "Are we available yet?" meetings where we talk about sort of like availability numbers at a high level. But one of the things that leadership does is focus on the success stories of like, hey, we had this problem, we did this thing, and now the result is we're more reliable. And I think spreading that message, leadership spreading that message is going to make people more motivated to be like, oh, well, I want to focus on reliability. It seems like something that we really care about. And like, yeah, facilitating rather than mandating, because if you mandate, you're not going to get anywhere.
That's
people aren't going to actually.
It's a strong motivator, right? What your neighbors are doing. There's like studies on it, right? If you show like, oh, your neighbors do this, right? People use less power, right? If they see their neighbors use less power. So yeah, I think that's something that we use in our organization. Is it's kind of hard to spread it, but the best way to do it is make it transparent, right? This is what this team is doing. This is how reliable they are, right? Their reliability, and allowing other teams to see that and see that, oh, that's cool. I want to do that is a great way to let that spread, right, and motivate. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this before, but I think actually enabling also like cross-functional collaboration, like allowing people to work together is really important. And that's, having those different expertise is gonna kind of naturally facilitate more of like a reliability culture because people can work together. You know, when there's, you know, too many silos and you have to just say, oh, it's somebody else's problem, you're not invested, right? Like it's just like whatever.
Yeah, and it's discouraging too, right? Like if you're kind of catching flack for your reliability or your team and your, you know, your organization, your product, your application, and you don't have any capabilities to kind of like do anything to fix it, it's pretty discouraging, right? So I think that helps a lot with like morale as well as just overall. I think it's better for the organization to have that deep collaboration.
Agreed. And I think another thing that's important is having like metrics and actually establishing goals. You know, it's hard to, like, we could say like, oh, we're getting better at SRE, but if there's nothing to prove that, like if there's no numbers to prove that, then you never know how you're doing. And I think that having that sort of like metric that you can look at and say, hey, like, you know, let's say like SLOs for some system, and like being able to say, hey, look, like over the past month, we've been hitting our SLO target more often than we were before. It gives you that motivation, and it gives you that like validity of like, hey, we're actually making change.
So I've always had the issue with, you know, some of these numbers, right, of metrics of being able to say, yeah, we're doing better. It's hard. It's hard to hit the right numbers, right? What is the real metric? What are some of the things that, you know, that you put metrics on that, you know, really determine, you know, are we getting better?
Yeah. So there's a I mean, it really depends on what matters to your system, but like, you know, at a very high level, I mean, just measuring availability, like, you know, even like if it's a web service, like how many successful responses are we getting over like our total sort of responses to the system? That's a very simple way to measure it. You know, and it might not always be 100% accurate, but like it gives you a better picture than measuring nothing.
Yeah.
You know,
Even those that can be really deceiving, right?
yeah.
And you know, really breaking down like the p value, right, actually is more you know, the latency and things like that. So yeah, it's always very tricky to get numbers that actually mattered, right? The metrics, because yeah, some of them can just be like vanity metrics, like yeah we're up, you know, they're all fat, they're all, you know, all going through, but they're super slow. So you know, it's like finding that real.
Yeah.
What's the saying? It's like all models are inaccurate, or no, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. I think it's a similar situation there, right? Like all metrics are wrong, but some of them are pretty useful. You know, you're never going to be able to empirically say like this is our availability, you know, but you can get pretty close to the point where it's giving you a useful measure to kind of like compare yourself against over time.
And I think it also comes down to like, what does your customer care about? Like, if you understand like what your customer expects out of your system, that can give you a good guidepost of like, what should I measure? Because really, it all comes down to the customer at the end of the day. Like, if you're picking random things, and like, let's say like your customers are okay with it taking 5 seconds to do something, and you are measuring for like, you know, 1 second, like you can be more lenient because your customers are like, well, I'm fine with 5 seconds. Like it's maybe measuring for like 1 or millisecond response time isn't as important in this case, but there might be other systems where it's like, yeah, they expect like under 200 millisecond response time, and that's where it's more important to like measure that.
And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because it is all about the customer experience, right? That perceived value. When, you know, you can look at all these calls are all taking 2 seconds, but all those calls that are happening are, you know, being cache preloaded, prefetched, right? So the user isn't experiencing any of it, and are, you know, it's almost instant for them. So yeah, it's very, very tricky to get the metrics that really matter. You got to understand the system and what matters to the user, and
And I know we already talked about values, but as we talk about this, I would wonder if there's like another one that we could kind of like point out that like you have to be customer centric in some regard. Like just picking like, yeah, we're 5 nines of availability it's not super useful if your customers don't really expect it, or if they're not using it, you know, 5 9% of the time. Having some sort of way to tie that back into, like you kept saying, Tom, like the value part of it, or like the customer feedback, or just like the customer input, I think is probably a value that you need to have an SRE in order to succeed.
100%, 100%. Like, yeah, if we're not understanding what our customer wants out of a system, like how can we even say that we're available? I mean, we can say that like, oh, our request succeeded, but that doesn't really mean much if you don't know what the customer cares about. I think another thing that, you know, that's important is embedding best practices in a way that like almost like guardrails, right? Like, you know, making it so like, hey, like you need to have these certain checks, or like, hey, we're going to already automatically measure these certain things for you, making it like super simple to do the right thing. Like, so I don't even have to think about it. And sort of naturally that's going to like change your culture, just because like that's just automatically ingrained to everything you do.
Yeah, like it's almost like a zero cost abstraction for like those sorts of things. Man, I first remember when I was like playing with like service meshes as an example. Trying to figure out like, well, why is this useful? They're really complicated. Why should I use this thing? And then when I saw that, hey, I get all of these metrics for free, it was a huge part. No longer am I instrumenting my application in like 5 different languages. I automatically get the request count, their responses, and then their error codes and things like that. Once the service mesh was there, every app that gets onboarded onto that, those metrics are pre-built in and baked in. It makes it much easier to, do the SRE, so to speak, when those things you're getting for free or, zero cost. And it's just part of something that you have without having to like engineer and put in a bunch of effort.
Yeah. It's that balance, right? Because sometimes you get locked in, or it doesn't have the features that you need, or but yeah, if you got to strike that balance, right? What matters to your company, and what you're trying to do, and if it makes sense, right, to really standardize things that way, and how much you standardize. But yeah, it can make it a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think there's process there too, right? Like I talked about tooling, but just having a document out there on how to do like a postmortem, huge. Like, don't make solving organizational problems are really challenging. That's kind of like why we're here talking about this, and just having like process in place, or just like something written down, it goes a long way.
Very clear, simple, right? Yeah. People hear documentation a lot, and it's just like, oh gosh, like you got to make sure that it's very usable, almost enjoyable, right? To go through your company wiki and documentation. That's what goes back to the culture, right? Like when I say it's communication, it's more about the async communication, right? Like your company wiki is, I feel like your biggest tool to set your company culture, right? And you better make sure it should be like the highest priority, right? Of your CEO is making sure that it's very clear to everybody. And yeah,
100%. It's like you have to make your processes just very discoverable, otherwise nobody's gonna follow them, right? I think another sort of point, is kind of ties back into the first point, is like having like fostering and like enabling a learning culture, like making it easy to like share knowledge, making it easy to like pick up and spend time learning new things, and having that sort of like continuous like, let's level up everybody, let's teach people new things. That sort of loop is like really important, I think.
SRE is really like not just from a here's all of the tooling and like things that we have, but just like it's a whole different way to think about availability and operations, and how that like works in an organization. So it is very complicated, and just having a level set and a way to get there really quickly. Some people have done some really good thinking on this and writing it down and making that available within your organization, I think is huge. And your perception of it and how you're practicing it and adopting it. Huge.
Hey there, guys. Hate to interject and interrupt, but we got a question here from Marty in the chat. It says, how do your organizations that track SLOs handle dependency services? Do you think it provides value to make these distinctions anywhere? Maybe when you're making decisions with your error budget?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you really, I mean, at the end of the day, you can only be as dependent as your dependencies, right? Like, And you can think about dependencies in a couple ways. You can think about dependencies as a hard dependency of like, hey, if this system goes down, like we have a problem. You can also think of soft dependencies of like, hey, if this is down, we can provide a degraded experience. So a lot of that's going to factor into how you think about your systems. In terms of measuring, if they have a published SLO, you can use that as a start. If they don't, you can certainly track metrics so you are tracking what you expect out of them. But I would definitely you would want to make sure that if they don't have an SLO, it's something to definitely work with that system about, because you need to know that in order to know how your system can perform.
I've seen it go kind of both ways, where it has been useful to own your dependencies, or kind of be able to say here's where we draw the line. I've seen it done both ways, successfully and unsuccessfully. I think just kind of having made a decision on one of those and working to make it better and being willing to change it, I think is the most prescriptive part there. I personally think that you should own your dependencies, though. I've seen that works well for me in my mental model. It's if I buy a hard drive, right? I know that hard drive is probably going to last 5 years, or let's just say if I want more availability, I need to go buy 2 hard drives in RAID 1. You can build reliable things on less reliable things. You just have to engineer that into the solution. So if you want to provide some sort of thing, you're kind of responsible for their downtime and failing gracefully. Obviously, this is going to be reflected on your users, but your application should still be able to handle that sort of failure. And I think it's important to measure yourself with that. Go ahead.
Yeah. What do you mean by owning it? Owning the dependencies? I
think, whatever the dependency is, maybe this isn't even an internal organization, an internal dependency or service. Maybe this is
external, right? Twilio API going down. Yeah, Stripe API.
There you go. I think it's kind of up to you to assume that thing is going to be unavailable, and you have to take action in order to make it unavailable in a graceful way.
Okay.
Maybe that's going and not using Twilio or Stripe or something like that. Maybe you go find a new payment processor. Maybe you have 2. I think at the end of the day, you can't just say, well, they're down, it's not my fault. I think each team has to own kind of their availability to some degree, in order to empower them to make the decision on what they kind of where their thing is going to go. You're empowering them to make decisions and be the owner of their kind of destiny and their future. So it might be not using that API. It might be investing effort into fixing one of those dependent APIs or something like that.
If you learn one thing today, be the owner of your own destiny. You can do it.
All right.
I think this kind of goes to sort of the last point, right? We're all learning in this together, right? And being open to feedback and being open to understanding different perspectives and continuously feeding that back into the culture is really important. I mean, if you sort of learn a best practice to kind of handle dependency failure, kind of bringing that back into the culture. Let's say you can bake into your libraries circuit breakers or something like that, right? Just continuously feeding it back in and iterating is really important.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I haven't met anyone that's figured it out yet. I certainly have not. Getting better is always going to happen. Time is always going to march on, and we always need to get better. And SRE is no exception to that, right?
Things are always changing.
Absolutely.
Version control, we're always making changes.
The goalposts always move somewhere else. Do either of you have any other thoughts? Anything that you think we didn't touch on for spreading SRE culture?
No. The big ones are kind of having that foundation, taking an iterative approach, which we kind of talked on here. I think those are really the big things, and having actual measurable goals. If you're doing those 3 things, you're probably making progress on SRE and getting better. And you're also doing it, you're doing it well today, even if you're not like where you need to be from an availability standpoint. Like the measure of SRE isn't like your availability, it's being able to control that and like improve upon it. So, even if your availability is really poor or not where you want it to be today, as long as you're getting better, I think you're doing SRE well. So
Yeah, I'd just like to add on, right? Like you said, the takeaway, owning your own destiny. Even if your organization doesn't do all these fancy things, right? Mandate you have SLOs and have very good documentation. It's on you. You can do it, within your own team. Make sure that the services that your team owns put those standards around them, the SLOs. Make sure you have very good documentation, so that other teams can see what's going on. Have very good transparency, visibility. So, it's not something that the whole organization has to change in order for us to do this. You gotta be the change. Start show that, right, like then that bottom up showing the other teams this is what we do, making it very transparent.
I think this really makes me think about like the broken window analogy, right? You have a broken window, and if you just leave it that way, like people are just going to think that's normal, right? And it's like, okay, like I can have broken windows and that's just considered normal. And be the one that keeps the very manicured lawn and landscaping, so that all your neighbors are like, oh, I should probably do that so I don't fall behind. You can be the one that elicits change in an organization, even just by caring about your system. Well, that's it for this week. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. Hopefully the conversation was good, and hopefully you will own your own destiny going out of this. And we would love to have you for the next episode. I don't know what we're going to discuss next episode.
I think we might be talking about auto GPT. I think that's the next thing, going back on our AI track. So,
oh boy,
yeah,
very cool.
Yeah.
And as always, the episode will feature expert guests and interactive conversations. So be sure to tune in and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Too.